Great. Thanks for spending the afternoon with us. We're going to break this up in terms of David is the policy analyst. He's going to dive into the policy details. He's going to get to that in a second. But first, I'm going to sort of lay out where things are right now in terms of the political and legislative debate in Washington and try to frame some of that, what's going on. And then the policy stuff that David is talking about will make much more sense in terms of the context of the swamp that is Washington. So really quick, I think most people, when we think about immigration these days, are thinking about the DACA program, right? The president promised to end it. It was an unlawful program created by President Obama. We sort of all know that history. Where that stands right now is it's tied up in the courts, as everything seems to be tied up in the courts. So a bunch of district courts have weighed in, and they're all saying that this president doesn't have the authority to end an unconstitutional program created by a previous president. Right? I mean, this is the state of our judiciary right now, which is why it's so important we get more Trump judges confirmed. But set that aside, the Ninth Circuit out in California is going to be hearing this case in May. It will get elevated eventually to the Supreme Court. That might be in the fall. It could be next spring, so this thing could drag out a little while. But that's sort of where things stand with that. When Congress looks at that, politicians look at that and say, we don't have to do anything. The court has everything tied up, everything's in limbo. We will come back to this when we're forced to, right? There'll be an action-forcing event that forces Congress to come back and actually do the job that they're supposed to do, because none of this stuff is supposed to be done by the administrative branch or the executive branch or the judiciary, right? This is supposed to be a congressional function. This is why we elect these people, even the ones we don't elect. This is why they're there. So think about that. This is sort of, we're in a holding pattern right now. But even the holding pattern we're in is really interesting. Think back to the 2012 election, right? What did the Republican Party say after Barack Obama won again? Does anybody remember the autopsy report that the Republican Party put out? They went through this big thing about how we need to modernize, they need to have new infrastructure. They mentioned one policy. What was that policy? We need amnesty, right? They said we can never win a national election, we can never win the presidency again unless we have a full-throated endorsement of amnesty. The demographics are out of whack, we can never win. Well, Donald Trump sort of blew up that thesis, right? Because the president tapped into something that most politicians in DC didn't get, and that people were anxious about the future of the country. They were concerned about the economics. They were concerned about the trajectory of where we were going. Trump understood that, he tapped into that, and he won. And it sort of upended this conventional wisdom from the Republican Party. They said, oh my gosh, how could he have won? We said this couldn't happen. So the Washington conventional wisdom was upended, but too many within even the Republican Party are still holding firm to that belief that you need to have amnesty. And that's really the context with which we saw this debate play out last year, and to some extent earlier this year, is that the president said, what was the president's, what did he want? He wants to have border security. He talks about a wall, but he wants to have a really secure border. He wants to make changes to the legal immigration system. And he put all of that on the table in exchange for some sort of codification of DACA. And here, I'm going to confess, when I looked at this coming, and David's going to start smiling here in a second because we had differing views of how likely this was to come about, I thought this was Trump's Nixon goes to China moment. This was where he was going to have this big deal that gets brokered. He's going to have all these accomplishments. He's going to take this issue away from the Democrats, and they're going to come together on some sort of deal on legal immigration changes, border security, and amnesty. And wouldn't you know, Trump eventually said, I'll give amnesty to 1.8 million people, right? The number kept ticking up, as amnesties always tend to do. But something happened. And David, to his credit, was very skeptical that they could ever come to a deal. Republicans were willing to come to a deal. Even some of our most conservative lawmakers in the House were willing to come to a deal on this. But the difference was that the Democrats, it wasn't good enough for them. 1.8 million wasn't enough. They would have gladly taken 1.8 million if it was free, but it wasn't. There were policy concessions there. But they figured out that they didn't figure out, I think they're completely wrong, and they have a horrible view on what the American people think and how they believe and act. But they are of the mindset that this is a winning political issue for them. They look at something like DACA, and they say, this is an 80-20 issue, right? To give these kids amnesty, right? That's what they think. This is an 80-20 issue, and obviously we're going to win on it. And then they look at other polling and say, well, only 40% of people want Trump's wall. If you poll it and talk about border security and fencing and securing the border, et cetera, that percentage is much higher. But when it's framed in this sort of narrow context as the wall, they look at that and say, well, Trump has an unpopular idea. We have a popular idea. We can beat him on this. And their base is crazy, right? If you, this is a little bit off topic, but I don't think you can under or overstate how crazy their base is. Pew had some polling, and it's Pew, this is a liberal organization, but they had some polling a month or so ago, and about half of liberals say that they cannot be friends with people who voted for Trump. Like it is incredible, just sort of the divisiveness, the angst, and the hate in many cases that the left has towards Trump and people who think that what Trump is doing is on net good for this country. And so all these things are driving them and push them away from a deal. And so you're in this weird sort of environment where you do, in theory, have a coalition there that come around a policy thing. Policies that we would find awful on one hand, some good policies included on the other. So you're in this weird position because of the sort of ferocious resist movement that the Democrats are part of. And there's another little piece playing into this, and we're going to transition to policy here in a second. The president actually tapped into something profoundly important when he started talking about and fleshing out his immigration policy and what he wanted. He was talking about ending the chain migration system that we currently have today. So border security is hugely important. If you ask the White House, the reason they were willing to trade off the amnesty for the border security is because the only way you prevent future waves of illegal immigration, part of it is by having a soundly secure border. That's true in many cases. There are other things that need to be fixed as well. But they also rightly identify this issue of family-based chain migration. The overwhelming majority of immigrants who come to this country legally are through that system, right? They get here because of no other reason than they have a family member who is here legally. That's not because of qualifications, not what they can contribute to the culture or the economy or civil society or anything like that. It's because they had family who was here, right? That's it. It is a totally backwards issue and a way to run an immigration system. And when you talk to people, they agree. There was a Harvard poll that 79% of people think that you should come to this country based on your skills and merit as opposed to family connections. When the Democrats talk about DACA being an 80-20 issue, this is our 80-20 issue. And the president's on the right side of it. And this, I think, is the thing that terrifies Democrats the most when you think about the political lay of the land and how Republicans can be on the side of an immigration policy that is actually overwhelmingly popular with the American people. And to give you a sense of just how broken this system is, before I hand it off to David, my wife was born in Honduras, right? So we went through the legal immigration process when we got married. And we were sponsoring her brother. Her brother is an aeronautical engineer. He graduated from Embry-Riddle. He speaks 3 languages. He has multiple businesses in Honduras. Honduras is not a good place to go. The president is right. He can't get over here through any normal way. He's coming through the family-based way. It's absurd. He's been waiting close to a decade to get over here. We should want him in this country ASAP, right? And it's not because he's my brother-in-law. It's because he's an aeronautical engineer that speaks 3 languages. Those are the type of people we need to be in this country. What the president is talking about moving towards hits at all those themes. It resonates with common sense. And when we get that message out, if we can get that message out, get those policies front and center, I think the left actually has a losing hand, and they're too blinded by their hatred of the president and conservatives to actually understand that. So I'll turn it over to David, who can flesh out some of those policy details, and then we'll have question time.
Perfect. Yeah, you've made it easy for me, Dan. So we're going to do a little interactive activity, actually. I've heard you've had a few of these over the past few days. But just to get into some of these, this what I view as a very difficult issue with many different people on different sides of different issues. And so what we're going to do is, everyone's going to raise your hand in a moment. I'm going to give you a statement or a question, and then I'm going to give you the answers. And when you agree with the answer, you'll put your hand down. So it'll sort of be a cascading effect. It'll make sense as soon as we do it, I promise. So can everyone raise their hand? And the statement we're going to go with here is that immigrants on the whole contribute positively to the U.S. economy. Do you agree? Are you indifferent? Are you unsure? Or do you disagree with that statement? So if you agree with that statement, that immigrants on the whole contribute positively to the U.S. economy, put your hand down. If you are indifferent or you're unsure, just immigrants as a whole. I agree. Let's just go with legal for right now. Legal immigration. So do you agree, legal immigration on hold, do you agree that they contribute positively? Put your hand down. If you're indifferent or you're unsure, put your hand down. So the remainder of you disagree. Okay, fine. Hands back up. We're going to do a few more of these questions. You see how it works. Should the U.S. accept more about what we do now or fewer immigrants? So if you think we should accept more, put your hand down. Legal. Unless I specify, it's legal, yeah. If you think we should take about what we do now, put your hand down. And so the remainder of you think that we should have fewer. That's fine. All right, a few more questions. How much do you agree with the following statement? Building a wall is a great way to control our borders. Do you agree? Are you indifferent? Or you disagree? So if you agree, put your hand down. So if you're indifferent, put your hand down. And so the remainder of you disagree. Okay, two more. Hands up. Sorry, I know. The water sports are outside. I know you didn't sign up for this here. Should the U.S. government care about and encourage the assimilation of immigrants? Yes, maybe, no. If you say yes, put your hand down. Maybe put your hand down. Okay, one more. Save the fun one for last, getting at the topic that Dan was talking about earlier. How should we deal with the 11 million people who are here illegally? Your options are going to be deport them all, deport most with select exceptions, deport some, but allow some to stay, or allow most to stay and only deport the criminals. So if you think we should deport all, put your hand down. If you think we should deport most with select exceptions, put your hand down. If you think we should deport some and allow some to stay, put your hand down. And the remainder of you would say that we should allow most to stay and only remove the criminals. Okay, that's it. That's all the questions. Thank you. I love doing this exercise because it shows that immigration is a difficult enough issue in America writ large, but this is a group of people who would all call themselves conservatives. I know you're conservatives, and I know you're sort of the central core of the conservative movement, and yet you all disagree significantly on pretty much all of these questions. Details do matter. Details do matter, but there are still significant disagreements here. And I think from studying this issue, there's been a few reasons for that, and this will impact how we think about the policies. So I think what's going on is that there's different conservative traditions, one might call it. You have social conservatives who are pessimistic about immigration, or some that are optimistic. You have your national security conservatives. You have other foreign policy conservatives. You have economic conservatives. You have your budget hawks. You have your rule of law conservatives. You have your libertarians and your classical liberals. These are all the strains of conservatism that our movement represents. And I think what we see is that not only do you have these traditions, you also have a whole bunch of different issues. We've touched on issues of enforcement and border security. There's also issues of amnesty. Do you do it or do you not do it? Legal immigration as a separate set of issues. How many people should we take? Who gets to come? What about temporary workers? We haven't even talked about those folks. Temporary workers. What about, and then questions of assimilation. Do we assimilate? Do we care? Are there things we should do or shouldn't do? So a myriad of different conservative traditions and a myriad of different issues. And I think that's how we get to what this crowd represents here. And what I think is really unique about the Heritage Foundation is that we, I think more so than maybe any other conservative think tank, are really dedicated to this idea of conservative fusionism. We pull together all these different strands of conservatism. We believe, since our founding, that we are going to have economic conservatives, and we're going to have social conservatives, and we're going to have national security conservatives. And we represent all of them, and we try to, as my former boss when I was his intern, Dr. Fulner, used to say, we add and we multiply, we don't divide and subtract. And so this is an area where we look for areas of common ground within this conservative movement to come up with our policies. So with that as sort of the baseline, how does that affect our policies? Well, it means that when we look to issues of border security enforcement, we're going to look at our rule of law conservative friends, the people who really care about that, and we're going to say, look, as Dan said, amnesty is antithetical to the rule of law. It undermines the rule of law, it encourages more illegal immigration, and it ultimately is unfair to legal immigrants who came in the right way and to American citizens. And as Dan also pointed out, it's almost always like the core part of these amnesty deals that get struck, and it's always the thing that they're wheeling and dealing around, and it almost always keeps ticking up as the debate goes on, because amnesty is what we're debating, and we always sort of kick all the other important issues of immigration to the curb. That's how these things tend to work, and it's really unfortunate. what it also means is that when we look at border security, we want to do really good border security. We need to do more. We need to have more border barriers. We need to have more technology. But we're also fiscal conservatives, are we not? So we're going to say, how can we be cost effective in our border security? We're going to do the most effective thing we can do, have the best policies in place to make sure the money we do spend is the most effective. So, for example, at a port of entry near a busy city, you want to have more border barriers. If it only takes a moment to run across the border and disappear into a neighborhood, well, you need border barriers there, no doubt. It lengthens the amount of time that the Border Patrol has to come and pick that person up. But if it's in the middle of a desert and the nearest town is hours away, is there a more cost-effective way to detain that person? And I would argue that technology is that more cost-effective way to do it. And so it's this mix. Where you need the border barriers, you do it. And where it might be cheaper and less expensive, but still just as effective to use the technology, that's where you use the technology. On enforcement issues, and I think this is a really important one, we tend to focus on border security. But what about when that person is picked up, the illegal immigrant is picked up at the border, or they come to a port of entry and they claim asylum, or they overstay a legal visa? What happens then? All these cases, you can do great border security, but you also need great enforcement. Arguably, you need the enforcement more because the enforcement is what actually takes those people who you've caught or you want to catch and removes them from the country. It's the ultimate deterrent in this regard on immigration. And so I think one of the things that we really need to focus on is how we can also improve our enforcement. This means that looking at programs, one of them that I love is called the 287G program. Basically, state and local governments that want to help enforce our federal immigration laws, we should make it very easy for them to do so. And sanctuary cities, on the other hand, we should be restricting their ability to hamper federal immigration law. So you have programs like, look at catch and release. That's a loophole that the president has identified. We've been yelling about it for a long time. Some of you saw this out front. We've been yelling about it for years. We have policies on the books right now. Some of them are in statute, some of them are in regulation, where we're picking people up and then saying, show up at a court date in Connecticut in 2 years. Go figure, and then many of them do not show up at the court date in Connecticut in 2 years. That's a problem. We need to do away with that loophole. There's many other enforcement policies that we don't have to spend a whole lot of money. Remember, fiscal conservatives, but we can have much better policy and make us much more effective at what we do. And these are some of the things that we're after on a day-to-day basis. Quickly want to jump to legal immigration. You've teed it off very well for us, for me here. We have, within our movement, we have social conservatives and budget hawks who are very worried about what happens when immigrants come to this country, especially if we have low-skilled immigrants, which is largely what we see with family-based immigration. And we have the nature of our system is that it redistributes money from high-income people to low-income people. And we have a welfare trap problem. People get stuck in it, and we don't want that either for the immigrant, but also for us as taxpayers. We don't want that. But we also are economic conservatives. We believe that the free movement of goods and people is a key tenet of capitalism, and that there are great economic benefits to be had from immigration if we organize it properly. And so what this means is exactly what Dan was talking about. We can move to a system where it is more skill-based rather than family-based. Right now, we give out 66% approximately of our green cards as permanent immigration to the United States. 66% go for family-based reasons every year. Only 12% go for employment. Look at Canada or Australia, other countries like us, those numbers are flipped. And for good reason, right? They are pursuing their economic benefit. They're saying we want people who, on the basis of their own merit, whether it's employment or a points-based system, they're coming to this country. And it's great, right? These people come in, they have high skills, they're going to earn a lot of money, they're going to pay more in taxes than they consume in benefit, they're going to provide us with economic benefits, and they also don't fit into the left's multicultural Olympics, right? These are going to be immigrants who are going to get here, succeed, and say, it doesn't matter what color my skin is or what my ethnicity is, I'm just pursuing the American dream and I'm succeeding. What's not to love about that from a conservative perspective? And so our proposal is basically to say, let's cut down on the family-based visas and move those visas over to an employment-based system. And I think we also have a paper out back that discusses that. And so I'll wrap up with that. We've got 26 minutes for questions. I haven't touched on temporary workers, refugees, more on assimilation, more on enforcement, but this is a great topic for having a discussion with y'all. So thank y'all. I'll let you moderate.
Start up front.
Yeah, one of the promises President Trump made was America First, which should really be a positive thing. And he said everyone's going to have to come in legally. to come in legally. And so he seems to be a little softer now and only going after the bad hombres. But a lot of us would be interested in him being more, I guess, proactive in deporting a lot of other peoples that are economic dependents. We're paying for their education, their health care. And the health care is another big issue, the millions of dollars. And I think the number one thing is we don't really have good analytics on the gravity of the problem. How many are really here? You know, it seems like everybody wants to just make a solution without really doing a good diagnosis. So.
Sure.
Okay. And I think one of the challenges that any administration has, right, is how do you prioritize? Where do you put resources that are limited and scarce? We saw the Obama administration use that as a justification to have DACA, right? They said, we have very limited resources, and oh, by the way, we're going to create a unlawful, unconstitutional program as a justification. I think what you're seeing the Trump administration do is go after the folks that are the worst of the worst, and doing that is setting an example. Enforcement, as David was mentioning, when people see the laws being enforced, that has an impact of keeping people away, right? It is an effective deterrent. In terms of how the administration prioritizes that, I think they're certainly being fairly aggressive. David can probably actually speak to the specifics.
I think that what we've seen is that there's always going to be a focus on the criminals and the national security threats. But the Trump administration has changed its policies, allowing them to, so that when they come across an average illegal immigrant, they are now actually allowed to remove them. Under the Obama administration, it was pretty much like, no, we will run the other way because we do not want to have to remove this person. They paraded the fact that we only deported people who were criminals. We never went after anyone else. They pretty much paraded it out there. So that has changed under the Trump administration. But like I said, there are still policies, some of which are statutory, that we need to change so that we can further unbind the hands of our good ICE agents. And also this means, like I said, this means we also need more help from the states, and also we need to stop the states that are hampering our efforts. So there is more to be done, but I think unfortunately, that's an issue which Congress, I think, increasingly needs to step up to. And as Dan started his whole speech on, they're kind of saying, kicking the can down the road again, which is typical for them on this issue.
That's what they do. Go up there.
Hello? A couple of questions that are interrelated to enforcement issues. I know you highlighted enforcement. How does the foundation feel about the E-Verify program, going after employees that don't check these things, don't go to the trouble of verifying somebody's status? Number two, is there any push within the organization, within Heritage, to speak about going after city and state officials that block immigration reform? Why not use the Justice Department under the usual thing that they get everybody, obstruction of justice? That's a pretty broad thing. I see no reason not to go after one of these mayors with the Justice Department and put them, her or he, in jail, period.
I could take the first one. I'll let you take the second one, I think. So on E-Verify, so our position on this is that E-Verify has its uses. It can be useful, but there are still ways around the system. So if you're an employer, for instance, right now, who you don't use E-Verify, and right now you're paying your workers under the table, we create the E-Verify system. We now say you have to verify your workers. You can keep paying your employers under the table. Now you've now broken another law. What does it come back to? It comes back to good old-fashioned police work, good old-fashioned enforcement. So even if you do E-Verify, which, like I said, I think it has its benefits, but it's not a silver bullet solution. We like to come up with these shiny objects. We think that they'll solve the problem, but I think even with the E-Verify system, if you made that mandatory, you still need good old-fashioned enforcement to say, you're paying your workers under the table. We've come to your workplace, we've found you, and now we're going to penalize you and remove. So that's the problem, I think. You still need the good old-fashioned law enforcement to back that up. And that good old-fashioned law enforcement is also good even outside the E-Verify context. So it can be used, but I think the other enforcement pieces are just as important.
To the second question, I'm not sure about sort of the specific legal answer to your question. I would say sort of the panel that was in here right before lunch, thinking about the left's tactics going outside of the democratic process to achieve policy objectives and the impact that has on our civil society when we do that, I think we as conservatives are tempted to use the left's tactics sometimes when the left is just so overboard in terms of what they're doing. And as conservatives, I think it's important for us to remember that there are systems of checks and balances in place, and sometimes those systems of checks and balances get out of whack. But if we're going to have a stable and sort of enduring civil society and a system of government that works, we need to make sure that we get those systems of checks and balances back through a democratic process and by winning the support of the American people. That's why I think I was emphasizing the chain migration and the polling on this so heavily, because I do think that our policies, when explained properly, I think President Trump's probably the only person in recent memory that can actually elevate these issues in a meaningful way and put Democrats on the offensive about it, that we can seize this ground back from the left and actually take the policy fight to them and win meaningful victories. That's the goal. I think we're going to be frustrated a lot in the process because you're going to have these mayors and city councilmen and so on and so forth doing some absurd things, and we'll have presidents doing absurd things and ignoring the Constitution at times too. But to make sure that we remember sort of the system of government and the checks and balances we have is crucially important. Yeah, and I'm not sure the specific legal definition of that and how it applies. It's an interesting question. It's one we'll talk with policy folks when we get back. But I think the overall point is, how do we make sure that we're winning these fights, being aggressive? Nobody should be shying away from it. You're exactly right about that. But making sure that we're not throwing the system of checks and balances out the door when we're doing it. There's somebody who has the next microphone. Oh, yep.
Hey, good afternoon. You didn't get a chance to talk about it with regard to asylum. We got this wonderful caravan that's coming up north here. Can you give us some insight on, from a policy perspective, how is this going to be handled?
Yep. And
are we going to get some wins?
Yeah, so asylum. Specifically, yeah, you've all probably heard about, or if you haven't, I'll just brief overview. There's a group of a few hundred, it's unclear what the number is, illegal immigrants, I think primarily from Honduras, who are trying to come to the United States. I think they've now reached the northern towns of Mexico, and they're planning to try to cross into the United States and claim asylum. Secretary Nielsen has said, I think, quite plainly what will happen. They are going to be entered into basically expedited removal proceedings as soon as they're picked up. They will have their asylum claims adjudicated by a USCIS officer, and if they lack credible fear, they will be removed from the United States in an expedited manner. Getting into the granularity, though, of the asylum process, the problem is that right now we've seen, I'm actually literally just looking into this issue because of the caravan. Asylum claims have skyrocketed in the past few years. I think they doubled. One type of them, I think it's affirmative asylum claims. You come forward and you say, I want to claim asylum affirmatively. They have doubled in 2 years, 2014, 2016, they doubled. You've seen an increase in people claiming credible fear, which means they haven't been persecuted, but they fear persecution. And so that's a harder thing to get into, which means you need interviews from USCIS officers and DHS officials, and often it gets kicked to judges, which is also why our immigration court system has the longest backlog it's ever had. Because even though we're adding more judges, and even though they're trying to move through these dockets, they can't do it fast enough because more people just keep coming in, and we keep saying, what are we going to do? We've got thousands of people who are claiming asylum, and we can only process hundreds a day. This is a problem. And so we need to look at how we can, A, get the resources to the border. I don't like the idea, first of all, of shipping them into the United States to have their cases adjudicated in a courtroom in Connecticut or whatever. You do it at the border, and then you put the resources there. That sends a deterrent message. But second of all, you also need to make sure that we are, I think, like I said, some of the loopholes that we're having, we need to close those down so that we don't have these problems. And so some of it's a loophole problem, but some of it's also a resource problem. But all of those together, I think if we fix those problems, you'll have a better deterrent of people wanting to come up here and think they can just game the system.
In the back.
Hi, I'm just wondering, I mean, we've put men on the moon, we've gotten cures for cancer. I can't imagine that we don't have bright minds to, as you were mentioning about the, the solutions to the immigration. To me, it's the elephant in the room is the Republican Party. I mean, you have all these great ideas, we're in power. I don't understand. I mean, how do you not get these people? I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. Is the Republican Party on the immigration bandwagon with Trump or not?
So it's interesting. A lot of you saw Paul Teller, who's here. He was up on the panel to start, or I guess it was on Friday morning, talking about his experience in the White House. I was talking to him before this panel. I said, "So Paul, what's the company line on the 1.8 million amnesty that you guys wanted to give?" And he said, the truth is that the president doesn't like this, but this is as much for Democrats as it is for the Republicans in the party. And let that sink in just for a second, right? The amnesty that the president was proposing was for as much for Republicans as it was for Democrats. That's still the party, that's still the Republican Party. It's still the Republican Party that's informed by the 2012 autopsy report, where they think that this is what they need to do. So yes, we have a fundamental challenge within the Republican Party when it comes to immigration. They will all say, we need a strong border. They will all say, we need to end the diversity visa lottery. They will almost all say, we need to end family-based chain migration. Right? They will say these things, and they'll say, oh, by the way, we also need to have amnesty for 1, 2, 3, however many million, however high you want to count. There's something sort of fundamentally broken within the Republican Party on this issue. Some of it is because that's what the business community wants, right? We've seen the Chamber of Commerce and all these business organizations that are Republican organizations. They're not. They're business organizations, and they want as much amnesty as possible because they think that's what is in the best interest of their business. But that still informs a lot of what the Republican Party is doing on this issue. So, yes, the problem is with the Republicans. The Republicans will say they back the president on the security and some of the legal changes, but fundamentally, at their core, they still believe the Karl Rove line that we need to have amnesty because it's the only way to salvage their political future. They have not yet wrapped their mind around why President Trump won, what he was talking about, and how to move the Republican Party forward in terms of the disconnect that Americans rightly feel with Washington. Go up here to whoever you want, Janine.
Is there a policy being developed for temporary workers? And if so, what does that look like?
Yes, so this is actually something that we are right now looking at Heritage. So this is the permanent paper outside. We was dealing with permanent immigration, but we are now turning to the issue of what we want to do with temporary immigration, temporary workers. And our long-standing position, though, that we've had before, we haven't fleshed it out a whole lot, but is looking at, we recognize that there are fields, especially seasonal businesses that need temporary workers. And if we want actually to, for instance, provide an incentive away from amnesty, if you provide the businesses with the temporary workers they need in a seasonal way, and you combine that with strong enforcement, whether it's E-Verify or it's just good old-fashioned law enforcement, you can say, look, hire these people, they have to go home, and if they don't go home, big penalties for you as a company, or big penalties, we're going to find the illegal immigrant and we're going to remove them. And you also give them the workers they need so they don't feel like they have to go look for illegal immigrants. And so that's where I think we stand right now. How exactly that we want that system to be revised from the status quo, we haven't figured out. But I think one of the things we do want is we want it to be easier to use right now. Right now it's a very long process, and it makes it, I think, it disincentivizes businesses from hiring some of these folks in some cases. We would prefer that system, I think, be a little bit smoother. And so, here's your illegal immigrant, a legal worker. They're going back at the end of the season, and we're going to be here to enforce those rules. But we're going to make sure that you have that worker so that they can do the work that is necessary to produce the crops or provide the service that you do, which is great for the American economy.
And I think it's helpful to talk about on that. The question is, how do we actually know these temporary workers are temporary and they leave, right? Mm-hmm. This is the problem we have with visa overstays. Half the illegal immigrants are visa overstays. How do we know these temporary workers are actually going home? And one of the things that I've heard you talk about, I don't know where it falls into the policy stuff, so I'm just going to throw him a ball. I don't know whether it's a fastball at his head or a softball, but one of the things that's been discussed is, do you hold on a portion of their wages?
Garnishing.
And you only give that to them when you've confirmed they've left.
Yeah, no, this is an idea I actually really like. You take 10, 20% of the wages that they earn, you put it in a bank account, and they only get it if they go home. So it's an incentive, and also if they overstay, they don't get to participate in future years. So once they overstay, they're now completely on the illegal side, and then the business will say, okay, now I'm going to hire a legal guy in the next season. So yeah, you garnish the wages and you punish the folks who overstay, and that I think is going to help you incentivize people to make sure it's truly temporary.
Hi there.
Good.
Being from California, I have personal experience with this. It's a sanctuary state now. My neighbor rented her home out to 6 illegal Mexican families, a 1,300 square foot home. Jeez. I live in a community where we have CCNRs, which are bylaws. We are zoned single family. The children of this household were damaging my home, beating on it and doing things. I called the police, and the Orange County Sheriff came, and they told me they would not approach the family at all. They told me to stand down, to not do anything, to buy a good set of earphones, and my association wouldn't do anything. And I almost have filed a lawsuit against them. I've never sued anyone. But the people moved out because I contacted ICE. I photographed 17 cars. I gave them the make and the model and the plates of each car, because in California, what they do is they buy used cars and they switch plates around. There's lots that they do that is not public knowledge. So my question is, it's really imperative with California being sanctuary. I think the Republicans and this organization has to do something dramatic, because if they win in court, other states will follow. And this is critical and crucial. And it's like letting the floodgates open. So number one, I want to know what's going to be done about that in particular. And then what I'd also like to make known is, for instance, in Canada, because my daughter applied for permanent residency there, part of the criteria to get into Canada is not only financial bringing, but they also have an age limit. Mm-hmm. At a certain age, they will not allow you in. And secondly, they require that you take a physical by one of their doctors, because if you have any health problems, they don't want that financial burden on the Canadian society. And I think that we're disservicing Americans by not telling the truth, the whole truth.
So I think I can handle both. So I'll start with the legal immigration question about Canada. Yeah, so Canada has a point-based system and has a lot of requirements about what goes into it. You can actually go online and take the points-based test it's kind of interesting. You see, could I move to Canada tomorrow on an economic points visa? Turns out I can. Good for me. I like where I am. But I mean, that's like an incredibly easy to use system, and it makes sense. It's just like if I was someone who's looking to take an offer of employment in Canada, I could go check today. It's not an official green stamp of approval, but it's something which it provides me the information I need as someone who might want to move. Like this is the points. This is how I can fit in that system. We should have a system that works is based on merit, and we know exactly what we're getting from the immigrant, rather than just, oh, you're the mother of you're my mother. That doesn't tell me anything about what you're going to bring to the economy or whatnot. And so I definitely agree on that point. And your first comment was about sanctuary cities. Sanctuary cities, we actually had the ICE Director Homan, come to Heritage and talk about this. He is very passionate about this issue of sanctuary cities, because fundamentally, it is just an incredible disservice, and it endangers the lives of his agents. The concept of sanctuary cities, beyond just what goes on even in the community itself, think about this. You have an illegal immigrant who's committed some minor crime, maybe, whatever. They've been picked up by the local police. Where is the safest place for ICE to come pick up that person to then bring to an immigration court? It is when they are in the custody of the local police. Even the left will say this. They will say, of course we want to remove the criminals. Of course we want to remove them. But then sanctuary policies actually say, no, those criminals, even if it's just minor criminals, we are actively going to prevent you from picking up that person and make sure that we get them out of our jail cells as quickly as we possible so you can't come arrest them. What does this do? It means that ICE agents have to go out into the unknown. They have to knock on a door, and they don't know what's behind it. They know someone's in there, and they're looking for them, but is that person safe? Do they have other people in there that they don't know about? And this is an incredibly dangerous situation, both for residents, but also for the ICE agents who are just trying to do their job. So I think this is an area where I think we should be hammering the left, because they say they want to remove criminal aliens, and they want to protect our law enforcement agents and make sure they're doing their jobs right, the best way for them to do their jobs right is to pick up illegal immigrants when they're in jail already.
Shouldn't this be a Supreme Court issue? I mean, why don't we cut to the chase and take it to the Supreme Court?
I think it's working its way there, right?
Yeah, I mean, the issue, and we'll go over here in just a second, one of the issues is the Supreme Court, just like we saw with DACA, they wouldn't let the case jump up to the Supreme Court. They knocked it back down and said, go through the district, the appellate, blah, blah, blah. So working its way up through, but.
And you've got the other cities, and sorry, real fast, the other cities like within California are starting to fight it. And so you're going to have inner California legal cases. So I have no doubt that it's going there. But, yeah.
Yeah, but you've got to deal with Jerry Brown.
All right, let's go over here.
One of the subjects you brought up early when you were asking us to put our hands up was assimilation.
Yeah.
I grew up, and I'm sure there are other people in this room that did, with the big wave of immigrants after World War II, and then the big wave in the 1950s, in the mid-50s from Eastern Europe. And those people who came in had to assimilate. They had no choice, and it was hard. It was painful for the older people. Today, we have areas. I know a couple people in Greensboro, North Carolina, one born in the United States, one who has lived here for 25 years, and they do not speak English. And I go to vote, and the voting signs are in Spanish as well as English. How did that ever happen, and how do we stop it?
Yeah, so.
As a former high school teacher, I want to give you my observation of what. As a former high school teacher, I want to give you my observation of what I saw happen. We had an influx of Vietnamese refugees that were in my class, and they came not knowing English, yet within a few months of being in the school, they were managing, and they progressed very well academically. Then later on, several years later, when we had the influx of Hispanics, liberals thought the best thing was to teach them in Spanish. And what happened? They did not progress academically. And it was much more expensive for the schools. They did not assimilate. That was my observations of what happened.
You know, language is a common thread which allows the citizenry to communicate and engage with each other. One of our experts who actually handles this issue like full-time, Mike Gonzalez, works at Heritage, and he actually went through that exactly what you're talking about. His family came from Cuba, and they got thrown into Spanish-only school teaching, and he didn't want to. It was just, well, that's what we're going to do with those people because it'll be better for them. It wasn't better for him. He'll proudly tell you that today, and that's a problem that we have, and it feeds into, I think, what we're seeing sort of the height of it now. And like I said, Mike Gonzalez, he works on this all the time. This multicultural problem that we have, I think, in the United States. We buy into this idea that certain groups just are inherently discriminated against, inherently need the government's help. We need government programs to be specifically designed to help them, and special benefits for certain groups versus other groups. And this creates sort of this tribal dynamic that we have. So rather than assimilate, rather than e pluribus unum, it's, well, if I identify this way and check this box, I get extra stuff. That's a problem fundamentally because it sets citizen against citizen based off of some characteristic that you fill out on a form, some of which these characteristics were created by the government back in the 1970s anyway. So you're artificially creating barriers and then dividing your citizenry, and I would argue because the left thinks it's a great way for them to push their agenda, not actually because we're helping these people.
And one of the policies that exacerbates this, right? So you have a family that comes over here from anywhere, right, and they settle in the United States. Then they can bring in their family, who brings in theirs, and suddenly you have people that with no connection to the country but their immediate family members and their family members' immediate family members, and you have an insular community. It's self-reinforcing. Even if that wasn't the intention that the immigrants had when they set out, it becomes a self-reinforcing policy because they can have this sort of element of home. And obviously if you go to a new country, that's a scary thing for a lot of people. So if you can familiarize yourself with people around you, we have policies that exacerbate that. So it goes back to the chain migration issue again, but you can see how all these policies layered on top of one another are incredibly destructive in terms of what we need to be accomplishing in an immigration system. Right up front.
Yeah, I think this is a continuation on the whole education area, is that we live in Florida, and there's high schools that have 70 to 80 different languages spoken. And how in the world can you educate kids that are going to have meaningful jobs 5 years after they're not graduating from high school? There's a real sense of urgency that I'm not sure that's getting across, that this is a no-win situation. The kids aren't going to win, and then we start, because they can't communicate, they can only communicate with their other friends, that whatever language, Bosnia, Rwanda, Croatia, it's coming from all over. It's just not the southern border. These people are coming from all over the world, and they're trying to, and it's impossible for them to be successful, and then they drop out of high school, they can't get a job, and then the next thing you know, they're in our criminal justice system or on welfare.
And I think, just to reiterate Dan's point, which is it is these multiple different things we've layered on top of one another, together with a system that doesn't prioritize skill or merit, but prioritizes pretty much everything else, that leads us to the situation. And I think a big way to change that, like I said, is to move, let's cut down the number of family-based immigrants, and let's move to a system where instead of 66% being given for family-based visas, let's make it so that at least 50% of our green cards are being given out because you have a job offer in the United States, and it's going to pay well, you're highly educated, and there's a business that wants you.
There's not a sense of urgency.
There is never a sense of urgency in Washington, D.C., let me tell you that.
And I hear someone saying enforcement. Enforcement goes hand in hand with this. It's not that you do this new legal immigration system and it just solves the problem. It helps. You also enforcement and a more, I think, market-driven, sensible immigration system go hand in hand together.
We have a red light flashing on us, and I know there's one more question in the far back. And even after this question, David and I are going to stay up here. So
yes,
all the way in the back.
My question is, does the Immigration Department have a list of its objectives? Like, this is our principal objective, to bring people to a level of getting into their community because they, will learn in English. Do they have any objectives that are visible?
Yeah, so one of the complicating factors here is that there isn't one agency that easily handles this. So for instance, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, is the person who provides the visas. You go through they're the ones who ultimately, determine who, give out the green cards and stuff like that. State Department has a role to play abroad. But USCIS is involved, but once you get to the United States, you're into the realm of whatever government agencies are handling domestic affairs. So HHS, HUD, in most cases, for most recent immigrants, it's going to be your state or local government. So what the objectives are, it's not really USCIS's place to do that. They're not dealing with the issues of welfare, generally speaking. One of the requirements you have to meet is technically you're supposed to not be a public charge when you come to the United States. That's a rule that's actually one of the first immigration laws we ever put on our books, interestingly enough, back in the 1800s. I think it's worth just looking at how that law is enforced. But beyond that sort of question at the beginning, once you get in, you're into the realm of sort of the domestic welfare and assistance agencies or your local governments. So the immigration agencies at DHS don't really handle that, unfortunately. I guess that's the answer. Yeah, certainly. There's no metrics on this, and I think you might get some metrics on some groups. So, for instance, with refugees, we get some metrics because HHS does measure some of their success, but it only goes a few years. We actually wrote a refugee paper, my colleagues and I, and one of the things we asked for was we want long-term metrics on this because we're bringing people in because they've got a crisis in their homelands. I got it, but how well are our programs working? Are they just falling into a welfare trap, or are they succeeding? We would like to know that, not just like 1 year, 2 years out, but can we do like an actual legitimate longitudinal study like we would do in any other business as to how something is succeeding or failing? Yeah, we should.
But before Josh comes up here and cuts everything off, I just want to thank you all for being here. And then I started off talking about the 2012 election, 2013, when Republicans were trying to pass amnesty. During that debate, the National Review wrote, I'm going to read this so I don't get it right, "The Heritage Foundation plays David against the Gang of Eight's Goliath." The work of Heritage and Heritage Action during 2013 was crucial, and I think what you've seen over the past 2 years, especially with the election of President Trump, that work continues to be crucial, and you've barely scratched the surface of what David knows. This is going to continue to play out over years and years and years, but we're going to continue to play David, hopefully with y'all's support.
Perfect. Since this is our last